All right. Hello, I'm Peter Kirkwood, and we're here today to have a discussion about strategies for segmentation and monetization of new business areas and how a couple different leaders in the industry approach that. I'm a strategy professional focused on identity solutions, and with us we have two panelists. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
Want to go first, Paul?
Ladies first.
Well, thank you for including me, Peter. And I'm Margaret Bouse, and I am basically a market development professional. I work in highly regulated industries like security and fintech and identity. And I focus on launching new products into new markets. So very happy to be included today on this session. It's going to be good.
Excellent. And Paul?
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Sun. I'm the president CEO for Anyun. Anyun is artificial intelligence software company where our software is used in the vertical sectors for security, safety, and also recently more into the manufacturing side. So it's mostly about using the latest technology to get more from the big data video.
Excellent. So let's start talking about the segmentation side of it first, and then we'll get into how do you monetize things once you pick a target. Paul, you just mentioned a whole bunch of different areas that that your product applies. How do you pick which ones to invest your product and your marketing dollars to really chase after? Is it opportunistic, or do you have a way of evaluating this?
Yeah, good. Well, that's actually one of the toughest thing in terms with new technology with artificial intelligence as an example, because it's such a basic technology. It covers almost every possible vertical sector that you can think of as application for AI. So for us, it's actually you're right. It can be challenging to make a determination what is the best ROI return on investment on a focus. But I think ultimately it comes down to a business case, the ROI side, and also a lot of times there's a little bit of the gut, feel to it. A lot of times where on a new technology like this, there simply is not a market there, so it's not well established. So it's not that you can go find a research and say, okay, well, this is what the data tells us. Let's just listen to the data, but there's no data. So that's part of the challenge of being a little bit on the forefront of the technology. A lot of it has to do with making the correct bet, and I guess that's where the challenge is.
Yeah, Mark, what do you think? How do you look at where to make those bets?
Well, it's kind of interesting because I think every great solution was inspired by something. It was inspired by knowing a pain or an objective of a segment. There's something that created that inspiration to create a solution. And so, that fundamentally, in knowing that pain, helps you target in on who might be experiencing that pain. And when you've got that core market that might have inspired you, you can also take that and look for other segments that have similar pain, like they're like characteristics that then you could apply into other industries. So, when I was talking about my background, fintech, security, and identity, they have similar pain points. And they naturally translate from one into another, and you can kind of create an affinity around that and go from there. So, and then there's always you have to test it, right? So you create a hypothesis that there's this segment that's going to benefit from your solution, and then you have to go and then do the work, right? And figure out and make sure that you actually have product market fit there.
So I love that point about testing. And usually people do a whole lot of planning and then launch and see what happens after they launch. Do you have any tips on how to test things sooner and cheaper and get a feel for if there's something there?
I think testing is so important, and everything from even before you start writing code, you can test value propositions and see if it makes sense there. And you can do something as simple as a sponsored survey or getting people together in a physical environment. There's lots of different ways to do that outreach. But I think it's really important, and it helps you get some early insights. And the other thing it allows you to do is build a community of users that you can use to get feedback from if you want to build a relationship with them over time.
One test I did for a new product launch we were looking at was to put out ads on the internet and try different messages, even though the product wasn't ready yet. If they liked the value prop and they clicked through to learn more, it was just an informational website. So it was a really low cost way to get the message out. And we saw that some of those messages had 20 times the click rate of other ones. So just that little bit of testing kind of tells you what works, much cheaper than waiting till after the clock is running and your launch is going. Paul, have you done data collection as you move into new areas?
Yeah, for us, I fully agree with all of the ideas that Margaret was talking about. One of the things that we like to do is actually do the MVP. So we tend to always emphasize to our engineer that we don't need all the bell and whistles, but just identify, to Margaret's point, the really key pain points and only focus on maybe not even all the pain points, just one or two pain points. Get the product out there, and then very rapidly recycle the process. And if a particular feature should be killed, just let it die fast.
Yep.
Right.
When we talk about segmentation, how granularly do you look at segments? Is it typically by a use case, or do you start looking at who the buyers in the interested company would be, or the personas of the end users? Or is it really just whenever people are doing this thing, I plug in?
I develop a pretty sophisticated persona. I look at everything from industry, kind of what roles people might have, how they buy, their geography, their demographics, their behavioral, and even psychographics, like what they care about. I think ultimately people do business with businesses that believe what they believe in some way, or have some sort of true north, where you know that the vendors that you're working with are on the same path that you are and trying to achieve the same objectives. And so it's really important to understand all the nuances, not just also of the segment or the buyer, but also of the stakeholders who are involved in the buying decision. So you might have an executive buyer, but you need to understand the persona and the profile of all the people who might feed into or help inform that buying decision.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of work. And you start out with your best idea of what that you think that is, and then through testing, and iteration, you prove what's true and what's not true, and refine from there.
Nice. Paul, do you focus on use case, or do you start looking at other characteristics of the buying company within those use cases, size of the company or whatever else?
The use case is a good place to start, but as Margaret was pointing out, that's probably not where you rely 100% on. It does take a little bit of stepping beyond the use case, and the standard phrase of customer is always right can be dangerous in an early product definition, because a certain customer may have a tunnel vision. So you do need to step out of that and do what Margaret's suggesting. Look at a much broader, look at the end user, look at different persona, even within one vertical, one segment. It's majority of the market out there tends to be fairly multi-dimensional, different viewpoints. So that kind of a broad spectrum of a collection of issues and use cases is pretty important. Yeah,
for sure.
I think that gets even more complicated when it's a B2B to C, or business to government to consumer, because the end consumer isn't the one buying it. They're not your customer, but making sure that they love the product and make your customer succeed is really key. So it's, have you worked in that kind of scenario? I mean, how much does the end user deserve your focus over your customer?
So we're definitely doing that at OV Loop right now.
Yeah.
We have a B2B offering that has a consumer experience at the core. And it's really important to understand both. So what is the business trying to achieve objective wise? And then they're kind of intermediary. They manage the relationship with the end consumer, but we have to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the end consumer in order to drive adoption. So I think with any of us that are in an ecosystem play where we have all of these different stakeholders and user types, the more that you can understand about each one of them and what their drives are and how they make decisions is really an imperative, because ultimately you want your solution to be part of the business process infrastructure for the business, and you want the consumer experience to be part of the fabric of their lives, so that you get that ongoing recurring relationship with them, and the transactional use and all that neat sort of stuff that it takes to make an ecosystem or a platform play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Paul, did you have different thoughts on that?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Margaret was saying there. I'll probably add a little bit color in terms of, well, we're much more in the B2B and B2G sectors. So a lot of times we avoid the possible chasing after a rabbit hole. And one of the technique that we always use is through an intermediary, let's say a system integrated that they sell to the end user. We ask them to commit in terms of real dollars upfront. Usually that can very quickly separate from the nice to have wish list to real pain points.
Yeah. Using behavior instead of just academic testing, it shows a lot of proof. I think there's something related about when you're trying to understand that end user, you can do a panel group and get what people say they'll do. But I think a lot of the most important metric isn't how much they say they like it, how pretty the UX is, but to what extent does it change their behavior? Does it drive incremental sales? And if you can get those proof points on the value metric for your customer, that's more than a nice to have. It really is the whole ROI case for your sale.
It is.
Which
we talked earlier too about how important the learning is.
Yeah.
And this is also like when we're coming out with the MVP that Paul mentioned, right? So when you're coming out with that MVP, man, be on top of your data like right away and figure out, are we on track? Are things progressing the way that they thought? Is the uptake there that we thought it was going to be? And if not, try and get to the bottom of it sooner rather than later. So using all of these things as learning opportunities only makes you better as you grow. And it's hard because we all have biases, right? And for any of us who are, startups or thought leadership, you go into something because you have a principle or a goal that you're after, that you're trying to achieve, and that can dangerously become a filter sometimes, or a bias. And
Right.
So being willing to look at that and make sure that you're on track, and maybe you have to question some of those initial assumptions that you necessarily had to make because you weren't launched yet, and see what's real, and what might require some adjustment, and sometimes even a pivot of some sort.
Right. All right. So moving on to the second part of this, just talking about the segments and how there's a lot of stakeholders involved in all that. How do you look at how to monetize something? Who to charge, how much to charge, what kind of metric to use? So maybe that's a lot of parts. So let's start with the who to charge question for the monetization. the assumption is the company you're selling to. Are there other models there that are interesting sometimes?
I hate to always keep going first. I have, of course, something to say. So
Great, go for
I
it.
feel bad, Paul, but I'll, for me, I'm always looking for a direct correlation of who's achieving the value, who gets the value from what we're doing. And then based on who gets the value, what's the role that's willing to pay for it. So, old school, follow the money is the approach that I always use. And there might be some Easter eggs in there somewhere where you find somebody who's willing to fund the solution that you didn't initially think about, and that's awesome. But at some point, it's really who's deriving the value, because that's when people are willing to pay.
Yeah. One part on that is, I think when you've got consumers in the ecosystem, they're paying a price just by putting that app on their phone. They're investing some of their attention, they're learning something new, they're taking some risk with data through hacking or privacy violations, they're using visual space on their phone. It seems like people have a perceived bar there that whether it's free or $5, there's still a perceived cost of some sort, non-monetary, but when you set those dials, you kind of need to subtract that from the value to the consumer part of it and make sure you can still get over that hurdle, and you don't overcharge them because you're not counting that opportunity cost. Paul, how do you look at who to charge? Is the case usually pretty clear in your uses?
Yeah, in our case, because it's B2B, so you're dealing with basically businesses, either they have a pain point, they have a need for a particular solution that we provide, or they don't. So it's, and the kind of software that we do is much more business oriented, mission critical. So it's not, typically it's not a nice to have kind of a product that we deliver. So in most cases, I think the monetization side for us is probably a lot simpler. We don't have that many different variations in terms of compared to a consumer type of product or service.
Great. Do you usually charge it based on a value metric, or is it a deployment or a monthly fee? How do you structure the pricing?
Margaret?
Well, for us, it's very different by persona.
Okay.
Kind of, we have a B2B pricing model and we have a B2C pricing model, and B2B tends to be kind of transactional combined with licensing, and consumer can be anything from freemium into some sort of consumption model. It really depends, and we've got a broad portfolio, but I think one of the fundamentals is how are they used to buying? So what models do they have within their business or their life of how they consume technology? And, in many cases, trying to fit that, with the exception of when it creates a competitive differentiation. So if there's a way that you can price your solution so that you're preferred over the competition, as long as you can withstand that on the front end, because sometimes that means that you're in the red for the beginning of a contract. So as long as you can handle that, sometimes that can be the way that you get the deal and others don't, just because you make it easier to buy.
That makes sense. Paul?
Yeah, for us, we probably, on the business side, there is definitely the freemium model that we do for the business users and customers. And the for us is the freemium, the part of it tends to be much more of just from a competitive standpoint, to make sure that we are not caught by on wrong end when there's a potential new competitor with a new business model.
Mm-hmm. Do you have competitors that are doing freemium, or is that a fairly unique approach for you?
No, freemium is a pretty widely accepted concept in the security safety business space.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's probably not as extreme as in the consumer type freemium, but you probably have an experience like for example, using a Ring, doorbell,
Sure.
the popular doorbell. So it's not to the freemium that you have a 10 free stuff, but you got one or two free thing. You get 1 day of free storage. So you do
Mhm.
have that kind of freemium starting to make some entrance into the more old style in the security industry with those kind of innovative business model is probably not as widely accepted, but it's changing. It's a very dynamic world.
Yeah.
Everything that happens on a consumer side eventually will the good ideas will be propagating to the business side.
And for a business, I imagine that for them to deploy a new security system, maybe even train the AI about some specifics of their setup or things they're looking for, they're investing a lot of time and effort, even if they're not putting money in yet. But that must make them very inclined to stick with it once they've invested that resources into it.
Oh, for sure. The stickiness of the product is of a product feature is always what we strive for. Is to strive to have a product that's very sticky and that just is fairly consistent, basic in terms of what we look for in terms of our product ideas.
Yeah, I
Nice.
agree with that big time.
Um, so what about, do either of you have cases where there's a network effect, where there's some users you're trying to subsidize to get more people into the ecosystem? Uh, or is that not really applicable?
So on the consumer side, we definitely want to build that kind of network effect and almost referral effect on for OV Loop in particular. You know, we're hoping to build out this great consumer base, and one of the things that we want to do is make it easier for them to interact and transact and have commerce with each other. And so there is a kind of like a natural network effect there. And we
Great.
want to do it based on the fact that we're providing value. Like, we don't want to force it. We're hoping that it's going to happen somewhat organically because they love the experience and that they have, you know, fantastic outcomes. I mean, ultimately, we're trying to serve them in a way that we're hoping will encourage them to, you know, bring us into their lives and, you know, share with others that they know.
Nice. What we've all been talking about the value that's coming and how to align price to value, which is obviously the goal. The nemesis of that objective is really price-based competition, where when you've got a lot of direct competitors, it ends up pushing towards cost plus very quickly. How do you look at that? I don't know where each of you are in that curve, if you're really able to claim the value now, and how, as competition comes in, do you stay on the being able to capture the value you're creating side?
I have a weird perspective on that. I
Let's
have
hear it.
zero interest. I have zero interest in working in the commodity business. That's a race to the bottom. That's a race to the bottom in price. Zero interest in that. So I don't have a lot of experience in that because I don't work for those kinds of companies.
That's one way to avoid it.
Well, it's Margaret is right. In terms of we always look at value-based cost basis. The value is what is the bottom line to a user. But having said that, we do have to we work in some of the in the security business where race to the bottom in pure cost is happening, represented by some of the well-known Chinese brands that were heavily subsidized by the Chinese government, and that has a huge impact in this security business. For example, if you look at the surveillance camera, on the hardware side, the
Mhm.
price literally plummeted from 5 years ago of on year to year, the average price decline or the reduction is well over a normal, typical through the manufacturing efficiencies. We're talking about in certain sectors of the security of the pure camera, we have cameras that price drop like 30–40% per year, year over year.
That is dramatic.
Yeah,
Wow.
and for those of us that operate in that world, so it becomes a very it is what it is. That's um, the competitive space. So a lot of times to survive, you do have to worry about certain product line that you may have to create to make it into a loss leader so that you are in the game. So we don't like to be entirely out of the game in a particular one just because entirely off the course, because there is strategic impacts when you are not in that kind of volume business that can
Mhm.
drive a lot of other strategic directions. So for us, it's probably a little bit more complicated, and it's never entirely cut and dried. But there is a certain point that if it's if it doesn't make sense, compete on a purely cost basis, if there's no other value that you can bring to the table, obviously that wouldn't make a lot of sense.
Right. Um, Mark, a follow up on what you were saying about not wanting to be in industries that get pushed to a cost competition. Um, when you look at markets and say, what companies do I want to go work for? How do you identify the characteristics that keep them out of that commodity game? I mean, what would you see that says, okay, this one can defend their value proposition in the long term?
Boy, that's a really good question. Um, so whenever I'm looking at anything, I look at the competitive marketplace and see kind of who's stacked against them, or are they the thought leader? Are they the industry first or best rank or on the track to that? I also look at the trends in the marketplace. Is it growing? Is it contracting?
Mhm.
Kind of, what do the pundits say about that particular industry and its future and trajectory? And also just, getting to know a company and the leadership. And do you have faith in the leadership that they're
That's a
going to
big one.
stay at the forefront and that they're going to continue to innovate? Because it's not just about invention, it's innovation when it gets adopted, right? Invention doesn't mean anything if people don't adopt it. So the industry innovation is really key. So I've been so fortunate. I'm trying to think if I ever worked for a commodity business. And, even my first job as a restaurant, there was something special about that restaurant that made it non-commodity. So I really don't think I've ever worked for a commodity company, thankfully. So I'm very
It seems like in
blessed.
general, startups don't start in commodity.
Right.
They have to have something unique. I mean, Paul, what you're doing with AI, that's a really exciting space.
Mhm.
And that kind of keeps things fresh.
Mhm.
I know we're coming up on time. So thank you both for joining. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I'll share a copy of the video once I get it packaged up. Any closing thoughts before we sign off?
I want to thank Paul for being such a gentleman and letting me go first on most of the most of the questions. So thank you. And I'm really interested to learn more about what he's doing. And just thank you so much for including me. I love these kinds of events and I appreciate being involved.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter, for hosting the dialogue, and um, enjoyed every little bit of it. So we'll look to do more of this. Okay.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay. All right. Take care. Yeah.
Thank you.